Welcome to Real Bible. I'm Carol Salee, and this video is produced by the Salee Group. In each Real Bible segment, we'll strive to tackle real truth from a real book and apply it to real life. In this Christmas-themed session of Real Bible, I'm presenting 4 Roads to Bethlehem. This is a study in which we examine 4 Old Testament women listed in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. So far, we've looked at Tamar, the Canaanite, who pretended she was a prostitute and had twin sons with her father-in-law Judah, and the younger twin, Perez, is in the line of Jesus. We looked at Rahab, the prostitute, and who after helping the Israelites spies to safety, was saved along with her family in the Battle of Jericho. She married Salmon from the tribe of Judah, and they had a son named Boaz, all in the line of Jesus. And then our last segment, Ruth the Moabitess, who just happened to marry Boaz from the tribe of Judah and have a son with him named Obed, who had a son named Jesse, who had a son named David, the shepherd boy who became the greatest king of Israel, all in the line of Jesus. Now, I've been giving each of our biblical female characters kind of a little short catchphrase, and I want to remind you, for Tamar, God writes straight and crooked lines. For Rahab, something no good becomes good in God's hands. For Ruth, God makes great doors swing on little hinges. And now we come to Bathsheba, and it may be one of my favorites. God is a God of second chances. There is just something built into the heart of humanity that we want a big cosmic do-over constantly. And I noticed this. I was just with my granddaughters, 2 of my granddaughters last week. Mom and Dad went on a trip. They call me Grams. Grams to the rescue. I spent some time with them. And we did a lot of art projects. We played a lot of games. We did some contests. They would try to show me their feats of strength and different things. And I don't know how many times they would say, "Can I do that again? Can I try that again?" Well, here's the thing about me as their grandma. I am so ready to grant second chances because I know that a second chance is one of the greatest gifts that we can give to someone. Well, that is the story of Bathsheba. She will discover that God is a God of second chances. And alongside of her, King David will also find out that God is a God of second chances. Well, let me kind of get you up to date by the time we get to Bathsheba. From the time of Joshua to the time of Samuel, judges led Israel. Well, during this time, Israel turned from God, mingled with its Canaanite neighbors, and started to assimilate aspects of Canaanite culture. Their complete trust in God alone began to decline. And this decline, coupled with the threat of the Philistines, threatened the very existence of Israel. And many of the Israelites began to feel the need for a different kind of leadership than the judges or the prophets to deal with this threat. So the nation asked for a king. Well, here's a question. How did a king fit into God's redemptive plan for mankind? From the Old Testament view, kingship had been prophesied for Israel. There was a prophecy of kings coming from Abraham. A promise was made to Judah about being the kingly line. So this indicates that God did not regard human kingship as contrary to his will for Israel. What displeased God was the manner and the timing and the motivation for Israel's demand for a king. It was because they wanted to be like other nations. Well, God didn't call them to be like other nations. He called them to be different, to be set apart for him. Well, their first king, Saul, made 3 critical errors of disobedience to God. So the main prophet at that time, Samuel, spoke of a new king, which would be David from the tribe of Judah. Well, at David's first appearance in the Bible in 1 Samuel 16, he was described as a man after God's own heart. Well, by 2 Samuel 7, when David was king over all of Israel, God made a covenant with David that had to do with David's son Solomon and with the coming Messiah, who was sometimes called the Son of David. A popular way of addressing Jesus, because it was known, it was a popular way of addressing Jesus because it was known that the Messiah would be a descendant of King David. And that's why we hear that the Messiah is the son of David. Sorry for that little blurb right there. So the promise to David was fulfilled in Luke chapter 1, verse 31 through 33. This is the angel Gabriel, and he's speaking to Mary. And he says, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. Well, that's in Luke. And if you went all the way to Revelation, the last book of the Bible, in Revelations 22:16, Jesus is describing himself. And he says, I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star. So when Jesus says, I am the root and offspring of David, Jesus is saying, I am the Messiah. I am the giver and the fulfiller of all the promises given to David. And on a side note, when Jesus describes himself as the bright morning star, the morning star appears only when night is over. And I love that Jesus knows the imagery there, that night is almost over when the Messiah comes. Well, David, from a humble beginning as a shepherd to a giant killer to the king of Israel, that has been his trajectory. So here he is when this story shows up in 2 Samuel 11. He has choice men in all the right places, a military force that every enemy respected, 60,000 square miles of kingdom, no defeats on the battlefield. He has wealth, a beautiful palace, and he's beginning to make plans for a temple for God. But 2 Samuel painfully proves the depths to which a person can fall after reaching such heights. The contrast between these consecutive seasons of David's life is staggering. David fell into a period of sin, and that sin had devastating consequences. Really, no sin except for the sin of Adam and Eve has received more press than the sin of David with Bathsheba. And it reminds me that we are all capable of such dark behavior. So 2 Samuel 11, we're introduced to a woman, and her name is Bathsheba. She was the wife of one of David's most loyal men, Uriah the Hittite. That's one of the Canaanite tribes. In Matthew 1:6, when Bathsheba is mentioned, when we saw Tamar and Rahab and Ruth, their names are actually given. But Bathsheba's name, it's like Matthew wants us to remember the second chance that was given. So in Matthew 1:6, it says, David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife, which is an interesting way to put it, because when David and Bathsheba had Solomon, she was actually David's wife then, because she was widowed. And we'll find out how she was widowed from Uriah. But rather than her name being given, David's sin still continued to get play even into the book of Matthew. And that was a man after God's own heart that God still used in spite of his choices, because he's a God of second chances. Bathsheba was also the granddaughter of Ahithophel, who was considered to be David's chief counselor. So she's a young woman with some serious pedigree. Well, at the time of year when David should have been at war with his men, David instead was at his palace. And palaces were built with a kind of a flat roof. And so the king, he could walk around on this roof and he could look down on his subjects. But remember, David was supposed to be at war. And so on this evening, he's strolling around on the roof of his palace, and he spotted, and it says a very beautiful woman. It just doesn't say beautiful, a very beautiful woman in one of the public bathing areas. And we hear talk sometimes of her immodesty in this situation, but we should remember everybody in the kingdom knew that David was supposed to be at war. So she wouldn't have felt like she had to be careful, because the king shouldn't have been up there looking down on his subjects at this time. Well, David sent someone to inquire about this very beautiful woman, and this was the report that he was given. This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite. That should have been enough. That should have been enough that she was married, because messengers did not typically describe a person in relationship to their spouse. Instead, they would give the person's name, the father's name. But basically what this messenger has come back and said is, the lady is married. Well, of course, David knew her husband was occupied in battle. And we would hope that this would be enough information for a man after God's own heart. David, in this situation, said no to all the things he should have said yes to, and yes to all the things he should have said no to. And boy, that's the thing. Little wrong decisions often lead to big mistakes, and we're about to see one. In verse 4 of that chapter, David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. And then in parentheses, the writer says, now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. The Bible does not give a lot of details. So when it gives details, we need to figure out, why does it matter? Why was that included? But she'd been purifying herself from her uncleanness, then she returned to her house. It's likely that Bathsheba was submitting to the experience that she just had with David rather than seeking it. I think sometimes she's painted as this very beautiful woman who's down in the bathing area doing something to entice the king. But we need to realize that given her era's state of women's right and David's role as king, there's no question that David was in a position to apply extraordinary pressure on her. Bathsheba had been purifying herself. That's what was commanded. The women were supposed to go and purify themselves from the 14-day uncleanness of her periods. So 7 days on her period, 7 days afterward, then a purifying bath was required. Well, here's why that matters. She was not pregnant prior to her intercourse with David because she just had her period. It was an opportune time for conception, and Uriah could not possibly be the father since he was at war during this time. So there's why that parentheses let us know what it was that Bathsheba was doing. We should assume reasonably that a law-observant young woman who was doing what was required by law for her to do after her period of uncleanness, that a young woman from a prominent family would have behaved as was expected, with modesty and humility. I mean, had David been where he belonged, in battle, not in bed, there never would have been a Bathsheba episode. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 5, 1st and 2nd Samuel is kind of about Samuel and David becoming king. 1st and 2nd Kings are about the kings. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles kind of retells what happened to the kings. So if you decide to read through the Bible, you're going to see a lot of repetition between 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But in 1 Kings 15:5, when it's talking about the reign of David, it says this: David did all he was supposed to do except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband. Well, David gets word from Bathsheba that she is pregnant. And at this moment, David has two choices. He can go before God, his counselors, and his nations and confess his sin, or he can go the route of deception, which could lead him into further sin. A 9-month pregnancy did not give David much time to act in order to create the appearance that Bathsheba's pregnancy resulted from her marriage to Uriah the Hittite. And it's interesting to me because it's like David, by the time she realizes she's pregnant, word gets to the king, she's already past the 9-month point for that. It's like David thinks no one can do the math on when this pregnancy actually began. Well, David instructed his general Joab to send Uriah back to Jerusalem from the battlefield. And when Uriah arrived, David acted like he was interested in the progress of the war. And then he urged Uriah to go home and spend the night at home with the very beautiful Bathsheba. So what David's doing is he's creating the possibility that Uriah is the father of Bathsheba's child. Again, like no one can do the math. But he's also underestimating Uriah, who ended up sleeping at the entrance to the palace like a faithful and loyal soldier. Uriah was such a man of character that he refused to commit any minor infraction of his duty as an Israelite soldier. Yet King David, the anointed one of God, abused his God-given power and attempted to manipulate a faithful soldier in a desperate scam to save himself. David conspired to first cover Bathsheba's pregnancy, but Uriah was too loyal to the king. So David created a way for Uriah to be killed in battle through his general Joab. David wrote a note to Joab, sealed it with his king's insignia, handed it to Uriah, and Uriah, the faithful soldier, carries it to Joab. Joab opens the note, and basically what David has said is, when you go to battle, the next time you go, put Uriah on the front lines, and when the enemy comes, step back from him so he will be killed. David has put Bathsheba in a difficult situation, and now he has put Joab in a difficult situation, and he is conspiring to bring the death of Uriah the Hittite. You know, Bathsheba knew it was wrong to commit adultery, But to refuse a king's request could have resulted in her own punishment or in her own death. And Joab, he doesn't know why Uriah had to die, but it was obvious the king wanted him killed, and you had to do what the king asked you to do. So I really want us to get a sense that the narrative seems to blame only David for what has happened. Well, that's one of the things we have to understand is we have to read from the Bible, not into the Bible. Though the text never tells us exactly what happened between David and Bathsheba, the evidence seems to indicate it was likely not a mutually consensual liaison. We tend to think of the story as more of a sordid affair and that Bathsheba was a clever opportunist. Bathsheba was a victim who was subjected to an abuse of power and who tried to salvage what she could out of the situation. In 2 Samuel 11:26, it says, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. Well, after her official time of mourning was over, David brought Bathsheba to the royal palace and made her his wife. So far, everything seems normal, if not reflecting even a certain royal generosity in taking in a combat hero's wife. So from David's perspective, this feels like the end of the matter. But this is only the beginning of the struggle from God's perspective. Sin was concealed from human view, but in verse 27 in 2 Samuel 11, it's still in God's view. And it says, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. I mean, how many of the 10 Commandments did he break? You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not lie. You shall not murder. Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, the prophet Nathan, he showed up to confront David about what has happened. And in Nathan's story, to get David's attention, we need to understand that the innocent lamb in the story is Bathsheba. And so what Nathan does, rather than just shaking his finger at David and saying, you have really messed up, buddy, he says, David, let me tell you a little story. There was a rich man who had all the wealth that you can imagine. And next door to him, they must not have had zoning laws. Next door to him lived a man who had very, very little, but he did have one sheep. And he loved that sheep. The sheep was his pet. The sheep slept in his bed. It ate from his table. Well, the rich man is getting ready to throw a party. And he's got plenty of his own sheep to have for dinner. But he tells his servant, go and get the poor man's sheep. Let's call it Fluffy. Let's eat Fluffy for dinner. And when David hears this story that Nathan tells him, he says, that's terrible. And that's when Nathan says, that man is you. David, you had multiple wives. You had everything. Uriah, your loyal soldier, he only had Bathsheba, and you decided to take her from him. So he gets David's attention. And in that conversation, Nathan prophesied that the child of David and Bathsheba would die. And David and Bathsheba suffered this loss 1 week later. By the end of this story, Bathsheba endured significant losses within 1 year. Her husband is gone. Uriah the Hittite and her firstborn son is gone. She would have been devastated by the grief as well as the shame of the circumstances. Nevertheless, God's sovereignty redeemed her. Scripture says that David comforted Bathsheba in their loss, and she became pregnant again, and she gave birth to another son and named him Solomon. Now, in Bible times, the birth of a son was equal to a sign of God's blessings and mercy. So here's Bathsheba. She was an unlikely link between Israel's two most famous kings, David and Solomon. Solomon would grow up to be the wisest man who ever lived, and he would be given the privilege of building the first temple for God. God redeemed Bathsheba's pain. Through the birth of Solomon, God showed his kindness, his willingness to forgive, and that he is rich in faithful love. God included her in the genealogy of Jesus. Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, came through David's line through King Solomon. That's in the Matthew genealogy. In the Luke genealogy, it appears that Mary came through David's line through another of David and Bathsheba's 4 sons, one who must have been named after the prophet, after Nathan. After this incident with David and Bathsheba, the book of 2 Samuel narrates David's demise and recounts Bathsheba's steady exaltation. I mean, many years later, as David was dying, there was some power play going on as to who would replace David as king, particularly by Adonijah, David's oldest living son. Solomon was not David's firstborn son by his first wife, or his first son by his second wife, but he was the first living son of David and Bathsheba. Well, at the request of Nathan the prophet, Bathsheba acted to ensure Solomon inherited the throne, as was promised at some point by David to Bathsheba. She stated, "David, you made this promise and you swore by the Lord your God." There's no biblical record of this conversation, but the behavior of Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba indicated a promise was made, and David responded as if he believed making Solomon king was the will of God. And we follow that down to the line of Jesus. And there's Uriah, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, included in the Savior's genealogy. There is a later incident when Bathsheba went to speak to her son, King Solomon, about an important matter that threatened Solomon's kingship. Solomon bowed down to her, and he had a throne brought for her so she could sit beside him in a position of power and of honor. So what does Bathsheba's road teach us? Bathsheba is for women who have been taken advantage of by someone in a position of power. Bathsheba is for women who have been treated as simply an object of someone's selfish desire. For women who have suffered the loss of a husband or the loss of a child or both, yet they still trust in God. Bathsheba is for women who have grieved deeply over the events of their lives. For women who rise from the ashes with dignity and with the knowledge that they matter to God and that they are loved by God and He has a plan for their lives. And Bathsheba is for women who believe in God, but more than that, they believe God. They know He is a God of second chances. So there we have it. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Uriah's wife Bathsheba, even Mary. There they all are, looking like they don't belong. Who could imagine that they would be included in God's journey toward Bethlehem? Even after studying their stories and then sharing them with you, I still can't help but shake my head a bit when I think about these 4 roads to Bethlehem. We must each travel our own road to stand before that baby in a manger, believing He came at all, and then believing He came exactly as God intended, and that He was God Himself in human form. This is where it all begins. God isn't just asking you to believe in Him. He's asking you to believe Him. Believe Him when He says you are loved and wanted and worth saving. Believe Him when He invites you to be a part of His story. Your life can continue what that baby began when he was born all those Christmases ago. Each week I've said, it's not that far to Bethlehem. But I must give you this challenge. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was the first to accept Jesus on His terms. And His terms are tough. He was asking for everything from her. And when she accepted, she simply said, "May it be to me as you have said." So this week, as you think about how you have related to each woman from these 4 roads to Bethlehem, as you marvel in what God has revealed about Himself, as you consider your own road and how God could use it to further His plan, let's end our time in the spirit of Mary. Lord, may it be to me as you have said, because it's not that far to Bethlehem.